Okay, so this video is following up on just the mechanics of supply and demand. In this video, we're going to be looking at trying to show the difference between movements along the supply or demand curve and shifts in supply or demand. So again, I just want to emphasize that this video is to complement the studying that you're doing, the reading that you're doing. This is not a substitute. Okay, so first thing is we've looked at supply and demand. Just want to review the idea of movement along. So if we look at the demand curve, if there's simply been a change in the price, that means there's been no change in the underlying behavior of consumers. So they're still following this idea of the demand curve. So again, we at an initial price, there's an initial quantity demanded. And if there's, for some reason, there's a change in the market price, so let's say that the price has come down, then we'll see an increase in the quantity demanded. So again, the only change that has happened is a change in the market price, no change in the underlying behaviors of consumers. So if there's been a change in the underlying behavior of the consumers, and that's what the demand shifter, the list of demand shifters tells you, then what we have is a shift in the demand curve. So for instance, we look at this demand curve, we'll say it's the demand for broccoli. So in that broccoli market, you have at some point, we'll just say at a given price, you'll have a given quantity demanded. There's been an influx of population. So there's been a lot of migration into this market, so you have more people than you did before. So by definition, that's a demographic shift. So we would see a shift to the right in demand, which means at any given price, so we'll stick with that original price. So at any given price, now because there's more people in the market, even if how they're kind of behaving individually has not changed, there's just more people than there were before, you'll see that at any given price, there's just going to be a greater demand in that market. More people are going to be wanting that broccoli just because there's more people. And so that was a shift to the right of the demand curve. So when there's only a change in price and no other changes, it's a movement along. When there's been a change in some underlying aspect of consumer behavior, in this case population, increase in population, we'll see that there's a shift to the right in the demand curve. So now let's look at the story with the supply. Same deal, at a given price, firms supply a certain amount of good based on their supply curve. So at P1, we see QS1 supplied to the market. If there's only a change in the market price, no other changes in the underlying behavior of firms, so let's say the price comes down, well, it kind of makes sense that we would see a decrease in the quantity supplied resulting from a decrease in the price. The only thing that's changed is the price. But again, if there's something underlying the behavior of the firms in terms that's represented by the supply curve, we would see a shift in the supply curve. So let's say we're talking about wine grapes, and there's been the adoption of a mechanical harvester for wine grapes. So that mechanical harvester, given the same amount of resources, but now with the mechanical harvester, the producers are now able to supply more grapes for that same amount of spending that they're doing. So that would be a shift to the right of the supply curve. So how do we explain that? Again, let's get rid of the second price here. So we look at the initial price, we have this initial quantity supplied, but now because firms are essentially more efficient, more cost efficient, they're able to do more with the same amount of resources, but now with a mechanical harvester, at that same initial price, because of their increased level of efficiency with the given amount of resources, they're able to actually supply more to the market than before. So that's a shift to the right. Before we had When there's only a price change, there's a movement along, but when there's an adoption of the technology, and that technology is one of those supply shifters. Again, if you read the book, you'll see what the other shifters are. It's a shift to the right in the supply. Okay? So now what we want to do is kind of bring them together and see what is the impact of a shift in one good on the behavior of, or the shift in the demand or supply and the impact on the other curve. So we go back to our original story. And again, I'll just erase this. So again, we want to keep in mind, so we had this initial demand curve, and of course, now we have to bring in that supply. So in this story, we were talking about broccoli. We had the initial demand, initial supply. We had our equilibrium price and quantity where markets were clearing. But then we had this change in the underlying demand as a result of the increase in population. We already explained why that's a shift to the right in the demand curve. So what impact does that have on supply? Well, because that population change is really a demand shifter, there's been no change in the underlying behavior of the producers, the supply curve. So all that means is that there's a movement with the shift in the demand. There's just a movement along the supply curve, and what we end up with is a new equilibrium price and quantity. That change in the population, increase in the population, and the subsequent shift to the right of the demand curve increases the price, movement along the supply curve as a result, increases the equilibrium quantity. So we'll do the same thing on the supply story. Again, we'll erase the original initial prices. And again, we have to add that initial demand. So we have the demand for the wine grapes, the supply of the wine grapes, before there's any technology change. We have that equilibrium price and quantity. So markets were clearing. We have this adoption of the new technology, the new mechanical harvesting of grapes. That causes the shift to the right in the supply curve. But again, this is not changing the underlying behaviors of the consumers, of the buyers of the wine grapes. So with this shift in supply, we have a movement along the demand curve. And as a result, we have the equilibrium price going down, the equilibrium quantity going up. So again, a shift in the supply causes movement along the demand. So that's a key thing to remember. The shift in one curve implies a movement along the other curve.